Hello, I'm Denise Birkhofer, the collections curator at the Image Center, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for Canada Now Artists in Conversation. This four-part conversation series is organized in conjunction with the Canada Now Photography Acquisition Initiative and the related exhibition, which is on view at the Image Center from September 14 through December 3, 2022. The exhibition features the photographic work of 10 emerging or mid-career Canadian artists from across the country, all acquired through the support of funds provided by photographer Edward Bertinsky and Nicholas Mativier Gallery. You can view the other installments of this conversation series right here on the IMC's YouTube channel. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two of these artists right now, JJ Levine and Kali Spitzer. Thank you both for joining us from two very different parts of the country. We're so glad that you could be here with us. I wonder, by way of getting started, if I could ask each of you to please briefly introduce yourselves as well as the body of work that we see featured in Canada Now. So I don't know, Kali, if you would like to get started.
Hi, I'm Kali Spitzer. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm Cascadena on my father's side, originating from Dalu, also known as Lower Post, British Columbia. And on my mother's side, I'm Jewish, originating from Romania. I'm phoning in and living on the traditional lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. And today, the works that I'll be talking about are from my series Exploration of Resilience and Resistance, which is about accurate representation from the communities I belong to, which are BIPOC and queer communities. And I am excited to tell you more about it throughout the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kali. JJ, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm JJ Levine. I'm living and working in Montreal, Jagge. And the body of work that I'll be talking about today is Queer Portraits, which is part of the Canada Now acquisition. And that project started in 2006. And since then, I've been photographing my friends and chosen family, mostly in their own spaces. These highly staged portraits are, they're all shot on film, and they are generally printed pretty large scale. And I guess I could say also that like the work really kind of revolves around community and friendship, and also a queer and trans identity.
Thank you so much, Kali and JJ. And thank you for those words, and also for contributing these important projects to the exhibition and the acquisition. We're so thrilled to have them. So while your approaches and methods to creating your work are quite diverse, we've chosen to pair you in conversation here today due to your shared mission of community representation through portraiture. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you about how do you define your community, and how do you kind of see your own kind of vision of community represented in your work, but also in the others' work, if you wouldn't mind kind of commenting on both. JJ, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that community representation is like at the center of my project. And I think that as you mentioned, there's, Kali and I take different approaches to a subject that definitely has like a lot of overlap. And I think that I guess maybe like the idea of collaboration is a way in which our work maybe diverges sometimes. I think that from what I understand, your work, Kali, really sort of centers around this idea of collaboration, including one of your projects that is in fact collaborative with another artist. But you talk so much about working in the studio with the people that you're photographing, and I think that is a way that maybe our work is similar. And when I'm making a photograph, there's a lot of preparation that goes into it, and that process is really lengthy, and the people that I'm photographing are often involved in many different steps of that process. And I think that there's a cooperation and complicity that is really essential to the work. And although I don't necessarily like call it a collaborative project, I think that like, you know, the like willingness and openness of my friends in each portrait is like what makes the image ultimately. And I think that that's also true about Kaylee's work, that it's like so clear that there's this like element of trust that exists between you and your subjects or the people that you're photographing. Sorry, I think if you don't use the word subject to refer to them, but yeah, just like that kind of dynamic is like so clear in your images. You know, the dynamic between like photographer and person being photographed, and like that presence, I think, really like comes through in your images.
Yeah, Kaylee.
Thank you, JJ. That's really sweet and accurate. And I was also looking at your work and reading about you and hearing from you that we have so many similar practices, and a lot of that is trust. And some of the things I'm curious to know from you is, I know that we both focus on photographing chosen family, people that we're close with. Part of the things that I'm curious from you is, and I'll ask this again later on when it's time for questions. However, just curious about how you feel that element of trust changes from somebody that you know and have a deep personal connection with versus somebody maybe that you've just met. And I loved looking at your work. I feel a lot of kinship between our work. It feels like honest, true representation. And like you were saying to me, I can really feel that connection between you and the folks that you're photographing. And it doesn't feel performative at all to me. It feels really honest. And I feel like I'm getting a chance to visit with that person by looking at the images. And I feel really curious to know more about them as well. And I think that that's clear in both of our works, that community representation and community consent, like caring for our community through these photographs as well, as a way of showing love. For my own work, I think it's really all about community. And my favorite part of photographing somebody is seeing their reaction to their image. For me, that's like the absolute heart of it and why I do it. And to see someone feel proud of their image and accurately represented, there's not really a better feeling than that. And I really see that in your portraits as well. And yeah, it's also really beautiful that you photograph with film. I think that I never really switched to digital, so I can't make a true comparison, but I feel like film, and for me, wet plate work, which is also film, I still shoot 35 millimeter and 120, but there's something about slowing down when you're using film that I think also adds that element of trust and a comfortable space. And for me, a lot of photographing and connection to community is kind of righting the wrongs of the history of photography and the history of it kind of being like a pretty violent tool. And so for us as queer folks to sit within our community and heal those wounds and create accurate representation and a space where people feel comfortable to be witnessed. I see that in both of our works, and I really appreciate that, because I think that photography is a really complicated medium.
For sure. And actually, Kaylee, it would be fine to jump into your questions now if you like, if you wanted to pose that question again about trust. I think that would be a good segue topic.
Yeah, for sure. And it's part of a bigger question for me. It's kind of, there's quite a few, but one, I'm curious about the queer aesthetic and the environment. And I know when you're introducing the work, you say some of that is staged. Was that correct?
Yeah, so it's actually all staged. Pretty much.
All staged. Okay, good. I'm curious, like, is this in people's homes? Is it your studio? How are you staging these photographs? And then again, I know that you photograph a lot of people that you know. So photographing people that you know and have a connection with, the trust that's there, how do you feel that differs from when you photograph somebody that you may have just met?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't ever photograph people that I don't know really well. And that process doesn't appeal to me at all, to like work with strangers. I think really like the relationship I have with the people I'm photographing are at the center of the work. And I have a few different projects, and some, two of my projects are maybe even like more theatrical and more playful. And in those, in that project, like the concepts aren't, I think the work could still function with sitters who I didn't know, but the process would be so different for me. And so I guess maybe I should be more specific. So these projects, instead of photographing somebody as themselves, the person photographing is like portraying two different characters who are interacting with one another in like a photo montage. And so, so yeah, it's not like essential to that concept that the people in photography are people I know, but for me, it's like an essential way of working because, as I mentioned before, my shoots are really long. Sometimes like they can take an entire day or an entire week. And so working with strangers would be like totally counterintuitive for me. And I'm also asking so much of the people I'm photographing in terms of the way that their bodies are presented in like very polarized like gender roles and gender representations. And so I think that, asking somebody, even if it's like a cis straight person, to be performing a gender that's really, really different from how they live their lives, that could be like a very vulnerable experience. And for me, working with people I didn't know would just feel like not necessarily like safe for me and for the person in the image. And so really being able to like suss out how the person is feeling at like every given moment during like a 12-hour shoot is like really, really important for me to know that the person I'm photographing is on the same page as me, or that if they were uncomfortable, they would feel like they could tell me that. And I mean, similarly to I think the way that you work, like showing the people in the images the final results, a week or like a month or like a year later is like a huge part of it too. So like having like giving the people who are in the images the opportunity to like rescind their consent at any moment, or maybe showing them a different exposure and seeing if that maybe is something they would feel more comfortable with. And so I think that there's just, it's so nuanced, like the way in which like every single interaction kind of comes about during, before, and after a shoot, that working with people I didn't know just like wouldn't make sense for me in my process. But I mean, in my queer portraits, that's like, it is just part of the project. Like I'm photographing my friends and my community and my life. And so, yeah, photographing strangers wouldn't really work at all with that project.
I appreciate that. I really have loved looking at your images, and I really appreciate that we both, I also operate that way. If somebody doesn't want their image shown anymore, then it's retired. Like a model release form is just a formality. It doesn't matter at what point. For me, if somebody feels uncomfortable, they don't want it out in public anymore, it's retired. And hearing that you do the same thing, like really, I don't know, that just makes me happy. I wish every photographer would do that. And okay, so my second question is, and I'm just going to read this to make sure I'm asking it properly. When viewing your work, I'm very drawn to the facial expressions folks have. Is this something you decide together? I know that confrontation and honest representation are very important and in the forefront of your work. Is there a reason that not many folks are smiling? Does this add to the feeling of confrontation for you?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that, like, as I was saying, my work is very staged, and that includes like everything that's happening in the image, not just the background and what the person's wearing and like what they're sitting on, or like what is happening like aesthetically in the image, but also with their face. And so the portraits are like highly directed, and that's true across all of my projects, that people's facial expressions are like really, really intentional. And there's like a few different reasons for that, and it's like one of these things that I started doing without necessarily having like a really clear like way of talking about. And not that I'm necessarily being that clear right now, but over the years it's something that I've thought about a lot and put like a lot of just like energy into trying to like figure out what is happening. And I think like there's there's different things going on, and one of them is really it's about like the way in which my images are accessible, and like when I talk about accessibility in this way, I'm not talking about it as necessarily like an entirely positive thing. and so I think that like making images that have different points of access is like really important. As like an artist, I want people to be able to relate and interact with my work and feel a connection to it, but I also want that connection to have limits. And so I think that, depending on where the viewer is coming from, like their own identity and what they're bringing to the table, I think that is going to really change the way in which they experience the images. And so I guess back to the facial expression question, I think that there's so many ways in which my images, I'm like striving to make really like aesthetically pleasing images. And I want like the identities of the people in the work to not be so easily consumed. And so like I think that for me there's like this tension between this like making like a beautiful image and also making an image that's challenging. And so I want to challenge people to like think about how they're interacting with this like static image and like the power dynamic that is going to exist between themselves as a viewer and the person in the image. And so like a queer or trans person who's like interacting with my work is going to hopefully, like in my ideal world, is going to feel like a connection in a way that maybe somebody who doesn't identify with the people in the images might have like a curiosity, but not that same kind of connection. And so for me, the facial expression is about, like I think that idea of like confrontation is like interesting to me. And I want to challenge the viewer, and I want the viewer to feel something that's like based on their own experience. And I think I hope there's like a point of entry for everybody, but I want that to be like different depending on where you're coming from and like what kind of like dynamic you have with the person in the image. And ultimately I want the power to be like in the hands of the sitter. And so I guess that's like a kind of long-winded way of me saying that I think having a portrait of somebody sitting and smiling is maybe too easy to consume.
I really love that answer, and it sounds like to me that you're providing space for us as queer kin to connect with the folks in the photo, and you're also providing like safety and a bit of protection for your kin in the photo as well, from folks that maybe don't come from similar walks of life and could potentially have more judgment.
For sure, I think like that idea of like protecting the people in photographing is so important to me.
Me too.
And I think that's like it's so clear in your images also that like you care so much about the people you're photographing. Like it really true, and it's so moving to like see images of people that are like made by somebody who actually like really cares about them.
I really appreciate that. I felt the same way when viewing your work, and I think that that is so important, especially within this medium.
JJ, would you like to pose a question of Kaylee?
Sure, yeah. I guess my first question is kind of like maybe more technical. I really love analog photography, and I actually at first encountered your work many years ago in a show at Never Apart, and was so excited when I heard that that your work was not only in Canada now, but also presented like directly next to mine on the adjacent wall. And that I think that like that dialogue that can happen between our work is really interesting. And like for me, like even though there are many different ways in which our work can connect, I think the fact that we both like shoot on film or like use analog processes is like a really nice way that our work is connected that maybe isn't going to be obvious to everybody looking at it.
Yeah.
But as like an analog photography nerd, I'm really like excited about seeing other analog work in the world and on gallery walls. I don't use alternative processes the way that you do or at all, but I'm really, I was like really excited when I saw your work for the first time. And yeah, so I guess my question for you is about the tintypes that you're making. Like I'm wondering like kind of just how it works in terms of like what is the format you're shooting in the first place? Like is the plate like large format, or like how big is it? And do you ever show the plates? Okay, so you're using like a 4x, is that 4x5 or 8x10? Oh wow. Oh my god, that's awesome. Amazing. Yeah, that's awesome that you're shooting 8x10. And I'm so yeah, my first question is, do you ever show your 8x10 tintypes?
Yes, I have shown them at the Portland Museum of Art. I'm dyslexic, whichever way that one makes sense. And that was a show with Demian. And that was quite a few years ago. And I had shown, I had still had the large format prints, and then I had the original tintypes on the wall. And in the future, I actually keep a lot of the tintypes because I want to build a whole wall. That's my goal, a whole wall of 8x10 tintypes. There's a lot more behind that than just a wall of our faces, but that's a goal of mine. So yes, I do show them, and I'm also like kind of hoarding them to show them all together at some point as well.
Do you like, how did you decide what that you wanted to like, I assume they're scanned or like photographed in order to reproduce them? Like how did you decide that you wanted to make like replicas of something that is actually essentially like a one of a kind object?
Yeah, totally. Well, part of what I'd like to do is I move around too much to have done this previously, but I'd really love to do them on glass and therefore cut out any digital component, and then I could make a print in the darkroom from the glass negative. So that's a goal of mine. And my teacher, Will Wilson, who taught me how to do tintypes, also taught me how to scan them. So I just learned that I could do that. And then the idea of replicating them and making prints is, as BIPOC queer folks and predominantly like as Indigenous women, we're often not seen and heard or represented accurately. And there's a lot of violence and racism committed against us. And so part of the large scale prints for me is, you know, in a lot of institutions and museums and galleries, those spaces weren't really built for us. And so the idea is to take up a lot of space, an accurate amount of space, you could say. And so by having the large scale prints, and the ones in the Canada Now are my medium size. A lot of the time I'll show larger scale ones. And a lot of the time there's voice recordings to go along with the images. So the idea is to really like hear and see us. And with the large scale prints, one of the things that I think about is the power that we have. And so the idea is also that you're kind of looking up at somebody and put in perspective as a little bit smaller.
Well, that makes sense. Sure. So I have another question for you, which is sort of changing tracks a little bit, but I was listening to an interview that you did, and you talk about you know, photographing people nude and how that is like not sexual, and I totally get that idea of wanting to like maybe like desexualize like the naked body, but I guess I'm curious about like how your queerness plays into that, because like when I see those images, I don't necessarily see them as like sexual, but I do think sexuality is like so central to them, and I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I think that like if I saw those images and didn't know anything about you and like the way that you work or your identity, I think I would still know that these images were made by somebody who maybe like identified with the people they're photographing. And so yeah, I guess I'm curious about like queer desire and like how like your own like queer identity, I guess, is like part of those images, but also like the nude aspect of them.
Definitely. I think that's a great question. And I also definitely change how I speak and think a lot. So I'm not sure what interview that is, but I think we're always growing and learning from our ideas, you know? And so definitely I think a lot of that is I don't want folks to view us as a sexual object. And so while there is sexuality in those images, that's what I'm pushing back against. So I do think there's sexuality for sure. I don't think being nude is inherently sexual personally. And some of the images I make are overtly sexual, and like we got to own that as well. So I think there's an element of both. It's just that I don't want somebody to sexualize us. You know what I mean? And I think like you were talking about that protection of people in your images, and I also feel that way a lot. However, I don't think that sexuality is inherently bad or anything like that. I think it's something to be celebrated and owned and embraced. And so, yeah, I definitely feel that some of the images speak to that. And then, you know, sometimes when I'm photographing myself nude, I don't necessarily view myself in a sexual way when I'm looking at those photos. It's kind of another way to create honest representation, being like, this is just me, and I should be able to be here, standing here without anybody sexualizing me, even if I am nude in these photographs. And a lot of the nude photographs that I do in wet plate, or more often in film, I also get in the photos with my friends and get naked, you know, and so there's also a comfortability there of, and that speaks to the collaboration too. Like I still view me being behind the lens as my view and my focus. However, like I view everybody that is involved in making images with me as a collaborative process, because I couldn't do it without them. And so, yeah, I think that part of being nude in images for me is just being comfortable, you know, and yeah, and I think we can't control how other people view our work. Of course, that's why I try to control where it goes and which images are seen by who. But yeah, I think some of them are sexual that are nude as well. Does that answer it, or did I just kind of go around in a circle?
That was great, Kaylee. And I want to just say thank you to you and JJ for sharing all of this so openly and candidly with your work. It's amazing how many parallels there are in your mission and in your work. So it's great to hear more about that. We could talk for so much longer, which would be wonderful, but in the interest of time, I also want to kind of maybe just draw us back to like a concluding question, if you don't mind. I wanted to ask you both one final question, which is just if you could speak a little bit about what it means to you to be a part of this Canada Now project, and what that name means to you personally for your work. So I wonder if JJ, if you'd want to share first.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, you know, when I initially heard the title of the show and the project, my reaction was like, maybe like a little bit of like surprise or like discomfort. I think that, like, you know, national identity is really complicated, and, you know, in like a settler colonial context, I, as like a white person, I like definitely try to like problematize any kind of like national identity. And so, you know, I think that it's like the Canadian art world, and like the way in which like the art economy exists in Canada is like really specific to our context. But yeah, I think, you know, the title feels complicated for me. But I also feel like extremely honored to be part of this project, and and to have my work in dialogue with these like amazing other artists. And so yeah, it feels like there's a lot of different like dynamics going on. But yeah, I definitely am like so happy to be part of this project, and I think that like place and identity are like really important in like so many different ways, and a lot of what the other artists are talking about as well. And so I think, you know, it makes sense that there is this kind of like reference to place in the title.
Yeah, thank you so much, JJ. Kaylee, we'd love to hear from you.
For sure. Like JJ, I'm really excited to be in this exhibition with so many amazing artists. One of my favorite exhibitions I've seen was at your center. So that's part of what drew me in the first place. The title is very complicated for me. I think that part of what you're doing is inviting a really honest conversation with this title and asking these questions. However, I don't love the title. My father was stolen to residential school, and I have never identified as being Canadian. Nobody asked me or my family if we wanted to be Canadian, and Canada to me represents genocide and continued unjust treatment of our people, felt today and still ongoing. And so, yeah, it just feels really complicated. And I also really appreciate the space to talk about these things openly. And had you not chosen that title, maybe these conversations wouldn't have come up, which are really important to be having. But yeah, it's like, it feels complicated. I don't even know totally how to speak about it, especially, you know, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has started the inquiry into MMIW, all of these things, and I don't see enough changes in, you know, our general community here. We still have a lot of work to do, and part of that is representing us in all of these spaces, you know. So part of that is bringing artists like myself and other artists that you have included in this exhibition, paying us. That's amazing, you know. So there's a lot being done that's good within this exhibition. And so while I feel really uncomfortable with the title, I still feel grateful to have space for these conversations.
Yeah, totally fair. Thank you again, both of you, for your candor and honesty. And we're just so thrilled to have you both in this exhibition, and that you could join us here for this dialogue. And I hope it does continue beyond this space, you know, whether between you two personally or with our audiences who may be watching this this video. So with that, I think that brings us to a close. And so I'll just say thank you once again to you both, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Bye.